Hey, everybody. Welcome to Encryption and Equity, a global call for consumer protection. My name is Graham Dufault, General Counsel of ACT the App Association. We're really excited to have two panelists with us today, Denise Talo and Heather West, who are excellent people to be drawing on their expertise and experience in this area. We're going to be talking a little bit about an issue that's been really important to our member companies. We have a few thousand mobile software connected device companies in the app economy that are all over the globe. A lot of them are in the US, but we're paying very close attention to what's going on globally in the consumer protection space, the digital consumer protection space, where a lot of proposals are being floated that would, they're very well intentioned, and what they try to do is enable better investigation of crime, try to enable better safety online. But at the end of the day, there are some that would really have an impact on kind of basic or I would say protection measures that we've come to really rely on. And so this is especially true for vulnerable populations, for folks who are at risk and part of at-risk communities in wherever they happen to be around the globe. Just to set the stage a little bit, the App Association has been advocating on these issues for a long time. We're fortunate that now we're really able to make use of really sensitive personal information and access services online that we've never really been able to access in previous decades. And that is thanks to kind of the power of smart devices, the connectivity that is increasingly ubiquitous, not quite there, but now we have better access than ever, right, to the ability to have and to live more and more of our lives in sort of a digital space. With that has come sort of an increased need to have an extra layer of protection. And there are two examples of this that we always point to, which are device level encryption, where the manufacturer doesn't necessarily maintain access to a key and doesn't keep access to the device. And then end-to-end encryption, or encryption of communications that are in transit. And so as people are connecting with each other across the globe, increasingly in digital spaces, and relying more and more on their smart devices to house information that they don't want others to be able to access, except in the circumstances that they authorize, we are relying more and more on that capability. Unfortunately, we do see efforts, though, to sort of undermine these protection measures. Vulnerable populations, because what we are seeing is that there's a greater reliance on these protection measures, are sort of disproportionately impacted by measures that would undermine encryption. So we're really happy to be able to sort of shine a light on how that works. And to talk about this, we have our two panelists with us. And Denise, why don't we start with you? Why don't you introduce yourself and give us a sense of your background?
Well, thank you, Graham. I appreciate it. Heather, nice to be on the panel with you. So I'm Denise Talo. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Privacy Vaults Online. We're known in the marketplace as Privo. And of course, we'll answer to Privo, Privio, people,
all the variations,
all variations of it. But basically, we are a children's privacy oriented company. We have been a longstanding safe harbor under the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. So that means that we audit and certify and run packet scan and analysis for our clients, that they are indeed compliant with the regulation. And we stand behind that through a trustmark service. As well, we developed an identity and consent management platform. So in techno terms, you would call us a customer or consumer identity and access management platform, single sign-on service for families, and we handle the verifiable parental consent that's being requested under many of these regs by doing the identity verification and consent management. We are, following all of what's going on around the globe. So it's a very interesting time, especially since I started this business 20 years ago and have listened to some of the same arguments for all of these years about why we can't get it done. I think we're going to be pushing forward and having to find some solutions in the area. So I'm excited to be on the panel. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Denise. So great to have you again as a panelist and to hear your perspective on all of these issues. And so I will turn then to Heather. Please give us a little bit of background on you.
Sure. Hi, thanks. And good to be here with you both, Graham and Denise. My name's Heather West. I'm a Senior Director of Cybersecurity and Privacy Services at Venable. What I do is one of those fun things that ends up being a little self-defined, but in the best possible way. I see myself as a translator between technology and policy, and that means that I'm coming in. I have a technical background. I was a coder before I entered this space. Not for too long. I'm not going to claim credit where no credit is due, but I help people understand the implications and these unintended consequences that you were talking about, Graham, of really well-intended policy proposals. And I think we're seeing that a lot in this space today. We're seeing a lot of questions about how we can pursue particularly important social goals, and then not paying as much attention to those follow-on consequences. And so one of the places that I'm spending a lot of time right now is thinking about encryption proposals, whether they're explicitly encryption proposals or not, proposals around how do we get access to this information, how do we get access to this data, and what could that mean for the security and the privacy of everyone online, but particularly some of these disenfranchised communities too.
Those are great pieces of background to sort of draw on and segue us into the discussion, because I think the additional layer of encryption, or however you want to describe end-to-end encryption, then device encryption, where a key is not maintained, it is sort of it's new in some ways, but it's not in others, right? I think for law enforcement investigators, for a long time, they've been able to issue a subpoena in the U.S. or some sort of legal process to that third party that maintains access to data for banking or other kinds of community, like phone company. They're used to being able to just get access to that information. And so in one sense, it's sort of new that their companies are not keeping the same amounts of data as they used to, but it's not new in the other sense that our private conversations where nobody else is around are not accessible, never have been accessible. And so it's, in that sense, it's really just an extension of and a natural consequence of having our private lives sort of in digital spaces more. So many of these proposals that we've seen, though, that have an effect on encryption, and I'll start with you, Heather, they're sort of marketed or sold as attempts to and legitimately, they intend to try and protect more vulnerable populations, like children, like Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQIA plus populations. But because the proposals would undermine encryption, do you think would they sort of ironically disproportionately harm these same vulnerable populations?
Thanks, Graham. I think that is one of the unintended consequences of some of these proposals, and I'm glad we're going to jump straight in there. Data breaches, privacy impacts, surveillance, that can impact anyone. There are plenty of reports of major data breaches that steal huge amounts of information from any number of people. They're not really seeking out particular populations, but those are very impactful, and they are disproportionately impactful to marginalized communities too, who may not have the education and resources to work to mitigate that. But there are other pieces here too that are important. I think some of these communities particularly benefit from having encryption and from having that information protected. I think, years ago, you can remember text messages showed up on your phone bill. The text of your text message, it said, Heather texted Denise and asked a question about where to find queer resources. And then Heather's mom looked at that phone bill and said, wait, what? And maybe that kid didn't find the resources in education that they really needed to find in that moment because they realized that they shouldn't be exchanging information and looking for information that way. That is an impact that most folks won't have. There are also other pieces. If there's, law enforcement surveillance of particular communities, they're going to be disproportionately impacted. I think, domestic violence hotlines use encrypted messaging to make sure that their, clients are protected as well. And so there are communities here for whom it is particularly important. And at the end of the day, impacting encryption will have an incredible effect on those communities and whether they feel comfortable and safe online and whether they can find the resources that they need to be happy, healthy humans.
You brought up such a great point. I completely forgot that on phone bills, text messages used to show up, and that is an example of data in transit that found its way to being recorded and on a piece of paper. And so sticking with you, how do the technical details of encryption come into play? Is there a difference between how end-to-end encryption protects communications in transit and how that benefits at-risk consumers? And then is there a need to discuss the kinds of protections separately from device-level encryption, for example?
I think that it is important to differentiate between those two use cases. There are different ways to use encryption, and they protect different things. I think that the vast majority of online traffic now and digital traffic is encrypted, not because anyone's trying to necessarily do sneaky things, but because we've realized as a society that these are important tools. When I buy something online, I want that data encrypted. I don't want anyone else who's on the network to then have my credit card information. I don't want anyone to know when they can come to my house to intercept a box. There are all sorts of pieces of that transaction that I'm comfortable with because that is encrypted in transit. And then there is this question of encryption at rest, right? If someone steals my phone, then they cannot necessarily get the data there because it's encrypted at rest. And I think that's important too, but they do protect different pieces of these transactions. And in a perfect world, everyone gets to use the same strong encryption tools. In a perfect world, that's all there is to it. We should all benefit from these tools. But to the point you're making, they do really benefit and impact different communities differently because they have the ability to say, wait a second, here's how I protect myself. And people do. They say, hey, have you tried this encrypted messaging app? Let's talk there instead of over a text message. And I believe that plain SMS text messages don't show up on phone bills anymore, but I don't know. I haven't used them in a long time. And most people have shifted to encrypted messaging, whether they know it or not. And that's actually an important piece of this, is that protecting everyone by default protects these communities in a number of ways, but it protects them even more because one of the things that's important is if, for example, folks who are in conflict zones, who are using encrypted messaging, they don't want to be the only people using encrypted messaging. They want everyone using it so that they're not sticking out for using encrypted messaging. And I think that's the same for, kids who are, trying to talk and figure out resources for themselves, or immigrant communities or others who can sit down and say, I'm comfortable with this and everyone is using these tools, so I don't stick out like a sore thumb. Everybody's information is protected in transit. That's awesome. I do think that there's a piece too that, we're all just kind of comfortable with these tools right now because we have over time become comfortable with that idea that we can trust the device, we can trust the transaction, we can trust the app. And when that isn't true, we get really surprised. And people say, wait a second, I need to use that encrypted app. I need to use the encrypted messaging. I need to encrypt my data at rest. And all of that impacts some of these marginalized communities in ways that are sometimes hard to understand, and if you don't sit within that community.
These are excellent points, and you highlighted a theme that comes up for us quite a lot, actually, which is the extent to which people have gotten comfortable with the protections that are built into smart devices, and sort of the protections that are built into the ability to vet apps and then remove them if they happen to be posing an undue risk of theft of data or an undue risk to kids. And so, Denise, turning to you, can you talk a little bit about the importance of trust in this ecosystem? Looking at small companies that are trying to cultivate that trust, especially if some of their target audience is kids, and for other communities that may be vulnerable in other ways. So, how does encryption play into that?
So I would, I have to take a step back and think about my mom, right? Who is a senior, active online, does a lot of shopping at QVC. Mom, forgive me for that. She expects her data to be secure, right? I don't think that she,
Right.
for a moment, believes that the data is not secure from her device, her PC, onto the establishment. And she's very comfortable with that particular company, so she becomes comfortable because she's an ongoing customer. But what she is concerned about is what happens to the data once it gets to the company. So I think that there's still a real trust factor in, are you going to sell my data? Are my choices going to be shared with somebody else? I want to just share with you. So I don't know that the average Joe is thinking about encryption or even knows what the word means necessarily or has heard of it. Rather, they're thinking, well, I'm not going to do any of my banking online, because they're still thinking, from a decade ago when it was probably a lot more at risk. I think now that's a education issue. If you're a sophisticated bank, a sophisticated entity that you're dealing with, they're encrypting, they're securing your data. But it's more about, do I trust the brand on that app that they're actually doing with my data what they should be after the fact? So I think that's seemingly more important to some. And when you talk about kids, I was with one of my little nephews, and he was sharing with me that something really bad happened, and so he wanted to know whether a VPN was what he should be using.
Oh.
Should he get a VPN? So I'm hearing more kids talk about a VPN because they're concerned about others getting access to their data. I don't know that he, again, knows what it is he's asking for, but he wants to feel not violated, right? He felt whatever happened, he felt violated, and he felt, so he was doing his own research and found, well, maybe I should get a VPN. And of course, now with all the porn laws that are passing, that are saying, hey, if you're in Louisiana or Virginia, you need to verify your age. I don't know that it's the technical part of the verification that has people worried as much as, you're going to put me on record that I access that content. Who are you going to share that with? It's like when I go through the grocery store and they say, all right, give me your driver's license. Now they want to scan my license for a bottle of wine. And here at my age, I'm like, no, you're not going to mark me down for my beer and wine purchases and aggregate that. And they look at me like I'm sort of crazy or silly that anybody would care. But I think big data is still the issue.
Right.
When people get fed back information, they go to another service and it follows them. I think it's more the creep factor that they're worried about.
That's right. Yeah.
Everyday transactions.
What you're describing, we see it. We see that sort of effect that small companies in particular see, that where they do not have the big brands, they don't have the huge marketing budgets, and can't buy the Super Bowl ad. And so the more commonplace encryption is, and the more their service rides on top of a secure ecosystem, the better chance they have of being able to, start in a good spot to start cultivating that trust, and that people will actually feel comfortable going with them. And the safe harbor that Privo provides helps in that regard too, to have the badge of we are compliant with these privacy requirements. They're pretty onerous, but we know that there is a service that we can rely on, and that checks our homework. And so it's all part of that sort of ability to be able to provide a service for people who are really sensitive to whether or not their information is being seen by others, whether or not they're being tracked. And so that comes down to, if you're part of an at-risk community, you're going to be looking at that especially, and if you're a parent of a young child too, and you want to
the whole idea of profiling and taking my I'm just investigating something. I could be doing it for myself or someone else, but I'm shy to ask that question because I don't want it to become part of my permanent record that somebody then makes a decision about. We all say, well, privacy, it's all gone, but nobody's tracking me. I'm not doing anything wrong. And then somebody does attends an event, any sort of event that goes wrong. And now all of a sudden they realize, wait a minute, maybe I needed to have better protection on my device. Maybe I needed to not be so identifiable as I didn't think that it was really an issue before. So I think it's like something has to happen before people really go, wait a minute, is there something more I could be doing to protect myself from anybody?
Yeah, it's these are questions that you don't want to have to ask every single time you open up your device, or every single time you download a new app, or give one of the apps access to your location, for example. These are things you want to be able to rely on, and not have to wonder, how is this going to impact my reputation, unless that's part of the context of what you're doing. If what you're doing is publishing information or a post or something like that, context matters the most. Context matters quite a lot, and that's kind of the touchstone of any approach to, certainly governmental approach to intervening on privacy, is to facilitate that dialogue and ensure that the company is respecting the context. So that's like job number one. But for some of the proposals out there, we're not quite seeing that sort of balance. And so I wonder if turning back to you, Heather, for a second, to talk a little bit about how legislation, mainly it's legislation, in some cases it's implementation of a statute, how some of these proposals in the EU, UK, US, Australia, and in other jurisdictions impact the effectiveness and the utilization of, especially for end-to-end encryption, but encryption generally too. There are any concerns about weakening encryption standards, and what's the intended effect versus the actual impact?
Yeah, thanks. That's a big question. I think, at the end of the day, there's a number of places, a number of jurisdictions who are proposing or have already passed laws that have the potential for serious impact on encryption, and thus serious impact on some of these disenfranchised and marginalized communities, on kids, on immigrant communities, on older folks, like anyone who's using their devices and anyone who's using these online services. There's even if they're not directly requiring companies to weaken their encryption, usually they're asking to help law enforcement get more information for their investigations. But even if they're not asking directly for them to use weaker encryption, or to provide a backdoor, or to simply allow law enforcement onto their network, they're asking for things that these services and companies can't deliver unless they weaken encryption. And so there's a bit of a dichotomy there about whether or not the law says directly that it's seeking to weaken encryption. But many of them have that impact regardless. And a lot of folks, developers, companies, platforms, are incredibly worried about the impact of these laws. Just to mention a few, a lot of these proposals are focused on CSAM, child sexual abuse material.
Right.
And really are giving companies a huge job In many ways, they're deputizing these companies as part of law enforcement to go in and to look through content and to then report back if they find any CSAM. What that, the part that doesn't get said is that in order to do that, these companies have to be able to see the content. They have to have access to it, and they have to be able to go through. And there are a lot of really good reasons to have that access. My email has this great spam filter that requires my email company to have access to my email. That's great. I love it. I don't want them to stop doing that. But there might be other things. Maybe it's pictures in my photo album that I don't want them going through. And I would like that to be encrypted. And I don't want these companies to have to not encrypt it, because I'm also worried about what if some cyber criminal breaks into that photo storage, and they get all these pictures. I think that impacts all sorts of folks and in all sorts of ways. But, kids, yeah. Marginalized communities, yeah. So in the UK, the recent online security bill requires a broad set of online service providers to filter content and scan for CSAM. They've said that they won't require companies with end-to-end encrypted messaging to scan encrypted messaging until it is, quote, technically feasible and tested as accurate. But my big concern there is that there's always been this gulf in the interpretation of those words. What is technically feasible to an engineer who's building these services versus what is technically feasible to law enforcement leadership has historically been different. I think, there was an op-ed in the Washington Post about backdoors and encryption backdoors years and years and years ago, where they literally it was the wizards of Silicon Valley. They thought that there was a magic wand that these companies could wave and give law enforcement access. And they just had decided they didn't want to. Instead of saying, this is an engineering problem, this is a math problem. And they couldn't figure out how to crack it. In Australia, there was a 2018 law called the Assistance and Access Act with voluntary and compulsory mechanisms to get into the content, including a provision that might require organizations to break their own encryption, which is, as someone who has worked at a number of tech companies, it is so distasteful. I can't even quite describe it. The idea that you have to go in and break your own security is scary.
And kind of go back on all the promises that you made to your own customers. And
right. And how can your customers ever trust you again once they hear you did this? In the EU, there's a similar proposal to scan content and look for CSAM, including encrypted content. They're calling it the chat censor law, some folks. And then, but there's an active discussion in the EU about whether it actually conflicts with some of their privacy laws to have what could potentially be ubiquitous surveillance within these networks and services. And then in the US, there's a number of proposals that might have similar impacts in introducing new liability or new obligations onto some of these companies if they don't take what's, a state attorney general or, the Department of Justice or others consider to be adequate means and mechanisms to remove CSAM from their services. I think, Denise mentioned several state laws around porn websites. We're seeing a proliferation of these laws. And I think that for me, the theme I'm seeing is that they're not saying they're going to weaken encryption, but they will. And they're putting the work on the tech company, which puts them in this incredibly difficult position where they're in this dual role of trying to protect their users, but also having to degrade that protection.
And I've heard lots of pushback along the lines of, well, we're really only requiring, the maintenance of a key or the ability to take advantage of a vulnerability that has to be built in for the good guys, not for the bad guys. And it's only for end-to-end encrypted. And so it won't affect other forms of encryption. What do you make of that sort of pushback?
I think, there's a piece of this where lawmakers are not experts in software engineering, and software engineers are not experts in law, and we should accept that. That's fine. That is appropriate. But I think that what folks don't understand is that encryption is math. Like, you step it back, and the core of this encryption algorithm is math. And so if you have something in the math that makes the math weak, there's nothing that says the good guy gets to use it and the
Right.
bad guy will never figure it out. There is absolutely nothing preventing that. And there's been a number of proposals over decades about how to create those backdoors, whether they are created by the companies making the encryption algorithm, whether they're something put in there by intelligence agencies, and we've never found a way we've never come up with a way that we can protect those vulnerabilities so that only the good guys get to use them. And so it becomes, for me, a question of helping policymakers understand what is and is not within the realm of the possible when it comes to securing services. We can build a wall, but people dig under it. We can open a back door, but someone will find it. And those are things that we need to step back and think about so that we can help lawmakers and law enforcement do the job that they're trying to do. I think the other piece that's really important is that everybody's actually on the same side here, despite the fact that it is often presented as this, two-sided debate. Everybody wants the same outcome.
Mhm.
Just talking past each other, and we're spending a lot of time fighting about one potential idea instead of sitting down and saying, cool, how can we make progress? How can we move this forward? How can we make it better?
Mhm. So, in different parts of the world, it feels like there are different versions of the assumption that it's not really math, it's something else, and we can find a way. We just have to nerd harder. And so, can you talk a little bit about what arguments are most effective and which jurisdictions? Just give one example is that CSIS did a report a couple of years ago about how in many cases the ability to have access to that communications content is not as important as it's being described, or as it's being alluded to, or as being as the light being shined on it by like the FBI and other law enforcement groups, and that we should instead really focus on sort of digital literacy of investigators and being able to speak the same language as the companies that are providing those services. In the U.S., that got a little bit of traction, to some extent, but curious what your experience has been in other jurisdictions and also in the U.S. What arguments can kind of help break through some of those assumptions about encryption?
Yeah, no, that report is actually incredibly important because what I hope everyone can do is to step back and say, what problem am I trying to solve?
Mm-hmm.
And that is an important contribution to that because it points out that we could give law enforcement access to everything and they still wouldn't be able to do their job well because they don't know how to use it. They don't know how to find the information. It would put everyone at risk for very little return. And so it doesn't actually serve the broad goal. It serves one very narrow goal. And so sitting down and understanding the goals of those communities is actually one of the things that I've spent a little bit of time thinking about. In the US, there's this idea that we can do law enforcement cheaper. We'll just deputize these tech companies and they'll do a bunch of it for us.
Okay.
And the CSIS report actually speaks to that. The idea that they don't have the resources and the training. These companies would love to partner. They would love to do that training. They'd love to say, here's what we can help with. Here's what we can't. But maybe you could check with them. And this other part of this digital ecosystem, maybe you can get what you need there. Or to train investigators how to use metadata, information about data to solve problems and solve crimes, instead of going straight to the content, which may or may not be useful in the first place.
Right.
I think in other jurisdictions, there are other social values that are also reflected in their in legislative goals. In the EU, for example, they speak a lot about privacy. They have this historical presumption of privacy. It's a fundamental human right. They have GDPR. And so helping them understand how some of these proposals impact privacy has been effective. And I think they've had to come back and say, wait, okay, we need to rethink this interplay. I think, in India, there's a different question, how are we enabling anti-corruption, and figuring out whether that's actually an effective tool or whether we can find better tools for them. For me, it actually boils down everywhere to how can we help find effective tools for the goals stated and unstated that they're pursuing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we, we also have to sort of balance the value encryption has as a prevention measure to prevent crime, to prevent all of these terrible things that could happen to somebody that result in an investigation, right? And stopping crime in the first place is part of law enforcement's goal. So to your point of rowing in the same direction, balancing against that, I hope would be somewhat persuasive. So, sticking with this sort of theme of sort of equipping lawmakers to best address these questions of ensuring that kids are safe online. Moving over to Denise, and as they are trying to, in the States and in countries overseas, trying to ensure that there is a mechanism to verify age, and either by mandate or developed by the private sector. There's definitely some conflict between ensuring that companies aren't collecting too much, way more information that they need, and minimizing data and all of that, but also ensuring that kids are not accessing content or being exposed to risks that they shouldn't be. How do you advise lawmakers on that? Really easy question.
Thank you, Graham. Okay, I loved what Heather said about what are we actually trying to solve here. So if we're talking about C-SPAN, we're talking about usually two adults sharing information encrypted end to end, right? And we want to catch the bad guys. So in the name of catching the bad guys, we need to be able to, regulators are saying, well, we need to be able to find this bad content that they're sharing amongst themselves. And we need to sort of take a step back and say, how do we get less of that content out there to begin with? Right. And is that what's going to make the difference in protecting the vast number of children, or are there other things that we should be doing, the low-hanging fruit? So I would say, look, if the reason that age verification is becoming such a hot topic is because so many kids have fibbed their way on to every service they're not supposed to be on, right? So what can we do on the front end to have less of them on the services to begin with? And I think that there is a tremendous amount of dumb, broken age gates that could easily be strengthened. And so I'll give you an example. In the world of COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, it says things like, if you are directed to children, but you're a mixed audience, you can put up a age, you can ask age, and you can accept the response that you get and then take your next step. But you shouldn't make it so easy for somebody to then go back and change their age. So, people would drop cookies. And now there's a lot of pushback on how cookies are going to be used, right? And whether they're going to be a reasonable approach here. If you have an app and somebody tells you they're younger, you drop a flag. But as soon as that user offloads the app and brings it back on, it's, gates open again. That could easily be solved with, no, once you've told us you're a child, we're going to drop, we're going to create a fingerprint related to this device and our app. And when you offload the app and you come back, the gate's not even going to open or ask again your age. It's going to remember what you said before. And now we're dealing with, okay, If you're really not a child and you made a mistake, dispute resolution. Now verify your age and get out of lockdown. But what we do today is we let all the kids go back, offload the app, come back, change their age, or parents who are part of this as well. What do you mean my kid can't have fantasy football? He's just trying to talk to his dad and his cousin. I want him to have this. Or what do you mean they can't have Instagram? They think of it as a fib for the moment to get some sort of access. And they're not realizing that, no, that fib is actually creating a fake digital ID that the kid can now use at 1,000 more places that they might go. So I think that we have to start with, I'm not a proponent for let's verify everybody at the front door. What I think we should do is have stronger age gates that listen to the first response. Not every child, not every parent is a liar. We shouldn't assume they are. We should have stronger gates. We should allow parents, and we should educate parents in the checkout line, the easy button. Is this device going to be used by a minor child? If so, parent, you need to take a step up and agree that your child is 10. We're going to associate this data to that true age. They shouldn't be able to show up at TikTok or Instagram or WeChat or anywhere else with a false age when the device could signal, I'm a minor knocking at the door, right? So putting some of these basic protections in place, listening for children knocking at the digital door before we make back to my mom again, have to verify her identity to put her refrigerator on Marketplace. She's going to bail out. She's not going to be part of the commerce transaction if she has to do that. So this is something that is really my pet peeve, is we need to stop believing that parents are incapable of parenting, that they have no responsibility in this equation. Companies have done a terrible job of listening or getting kids off of their services. And we're seeing that in the press now. We know that. At the same time, parents have been left with this understanding that they're just getting their kid into the R-rated movie and they're there with them and everything's going to be fine afterwards. And it's actually not. So we need to bring the parents and the companies in the room together and say both sides are responsible for protecting children. So why does a 10-year-old have access to a service that's 13 and over? Because they lied about their age. And let's first start with them before we make every single person have to verify their identity to protect the children whose parents have paid a little attention to why it's okay to lie. Since when did it become okay to be perpetual liars just to get a game?
The internet doesn't change what should be our moral code. It's a convenience thing because, and it's in part because, and the FTC has said this in multiple different ways. The FTC, which enforces COPPA, FTC commissioners from both parties will all say, an effective privacy regime will be one that is actually usable, and it's one that's not going to put too much on one party or the other. You mentioned, and Heather mentioned, like this putting everything on these companies to create a hole in encryption and have it only available to good actors. That puts a lot on the company, and it's kind of an unrealistic thing to expect. And so the same is sort of true as a parent myself. For parents where you don't want to have to, do verified parental consent for every single, service. And to your point, Denise, that there is a lot of appeal to, a mechanism where you can have a flag that's sent and that can, sort of respect the device, to understand which device it is and understand the identity, but not transfer any of that information to every single service on the internet that happened to be accessed by a child or by the parent or both. And so,
yeah, I mean, you take most kids log on to these services, they use their phone number. An email is a throwaway. You can get a new email, so those services should be looking, is this email just been created yesterday? Is it, has it not been around very long? Well, then it's likely not to be an adult who's using it. And they gather information under the covers that they can make some decisions and escalate when to turn on these next level of just-in-time verification. But phone numbers are what the kids use, and they can't just throw out and get a new phone number easily. The services can know whether these phone numbers are coming from a carrier or not. So I'm a big advocate, and we are launching a service direct to parents that says, hey, parents, we've got your back. Register your child's device and data. And I'm going to get to encryption here in a second. Register that data to their true age, and we will act as your advocate. When that device or that data shows up at the front door of these services, we're going to ask them to listen for the signal that this is a minor. If we could put, you've got a flag you could put into the HTTP header that any of them could read. So we're going to push for something called age protect. If a parent puts an age protect flag into the header, or if anyone puts an age protect flag, assume it's a minor device until they can prove that they're an adult, versus making all of us prove we're adults to protect the minors. Again, I feel like we've got to start educating the parents that no, it's not okay to give your kid a device in the middle of the night to be in their bedroom talking to anybody in the world they want to. They've got to have, they assume that the companies are doing all the protection, when really they need to put a little common sense to work and say, yeah, I wouldn't drop my kid off down the street at the bar to sing karaoke and get a beer with the guys, right? And come back and pick them up the next day. So why are we doing that with the devices and their data? So we're going to really push for companies to start listening so that parents can educate other parents and more kids can be identified. So where do we get to encryption? Well, you can't have a big database in the sky of children's data, then that becomes an attack vector. So we need to use hashing mechanisms, right? And when you think of COPPA, it used to talk to encryption, where if you take an email address for a kid's access and you hash that, you're not deemed to have personal information. You don't have to. So you want to create an account for a child, you're not going to let them share their data. You don't want to have to send messages off to the parent just for the basic level account. Then hash that email so it can only be recovered in password reset. You can't use it for marketing purposes. In this service that we're talking about, every piece that system is going to have an age and identifiers, and each of those identifiers will be hashed. And if that data shows up at the subscribing company, that data will be hashed, and we'll do a lookup. Does the data exist in hash? Do we have a match? Yes. Is the age within your terms of service? Yes or no? It lets them make a graduated decision towards what they're going to do next. And we need to look towards things like this, because I don't think age verification for everyone is going to, it's going to get past the constitutionality fights that are happening.
That's right. And we're, what you're describing does, it takes on that enforcement problem that the FTC has always had with COPPA, where companies will have a general audience and they'll say, I really don't know what age this person is. And it's always been really tough to do something more than just age gating. And then, that initial VPC, if it's a child facing service, which again, there's a lot of a major incentive to avoid having to, put that on parents, and, for good reason, because it's tough to do. Right.
Well, and the online harms to teenagers that we're talking about.
Right. Right.
Half the population of kids in the 5th grade have a TikTok account that's public facing. So none of that's encrypted. Anybody can see what's public facing. They need to scan and get that data out of their systems and shut down those accounts. And it's going to upset people at the dinner table. But, we can't just keep pretending like, it's skewing the results, right? Of course, a teenager is having problems with, certain aspects of what they're trying to do when it's really an 8-year-old who said they were a 14-year-old. And so we have to sort of ferret out how many of the kids are getting in against the rules. And we have to do some more education with parents, because I promise you, they don't get it. They don't understand why that little fib turns into something downstream that's much, much greater.
Right. Well, speaking of TikTok, there is, that's one of the main reasons there for Congress to start working on and responding to sort of the Haugen revelations around, the use of social media, some of the potentially negative consequences of being on platforms all the time. And so, that's given rise to a lot of efforts in the States, a lot of efforts overseas, and now at the federal level with the Kids Online Safety Act. For both of you, the efforts that are ongoing by policymakers to try and take on content moderation, but then also privacy and online safety, addressing CSAM and other related issues, they all share common roots in sort of a general consumer protection, trying to protect people online. But proposals falling into each of those categories appear to diverge sort of significantly from each other in the way they operate. So what's your advice to legislators that are trying to tackle all of these at the same time?
I mean, it may seem appealing to tackle them all at the same time, but it's probably misguided. You cannot boil the ocean on these issues, and each of these goals. Like, if we were to step back and say, what are you actually trying to solve? All of these questions have different goals. And they are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they are things you have to sit down and think through and be intentional about pursuing. 15, 20 years ago, this all did get wrapped up into one bucket, and all of the, these organizations were doing technology policy. I worked at one. And we did a little bit of everything, and it made sense because the space was small and the technology was more new. Now, as we have a more integrated technology experience in our lives, how many times are you interacting with these services and devices every day? The context has changed, and we have more nuance in these questions. How we know how to protect these services more. What does that mean for privacy? What does that mean for security? What does that mean for safety? I would ask them not to address them all at once.
Good sage advice from my perspective. Denise, how about you? And then we probably should wrap this up. I know we have a hard stop in about 4 minutes.
Just don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We've got to take steps towards a better end game. If we try to go for the whole enchilada, we're going to be talking about it 5 years from now again. So, as an example, I know, yes, minors are 17 and under. They can't sign contracts. That's the elephant in the room to begin with, why all the kids are signing contracts. But let's face it, if you're 17 years old, you've got a job, you've graduated high school sometimes, you've been emancipated. Like, let's agree to protect perhaps 15 and under and get at a reasonable spot, because just dragging in the 16 and 17-year-olds is I think is a loose, it really drives us into a bigger argument, right? And then we don't protect the 13 or 14-year-old. So on one hand, I would say, let's consider not trying to climb so high in the age and get the younger ones taken care of first. Let's force companies to have to do better age gates instead of pretending like the gates can't work, because they actually can do a better job. Let's listen for, let's make it easier for parents and others to tell these services that they believe children are at risk, attack the addictive algorithms and whatnot, versus and this idea of trying to separate, put all the kids in one world and all the adults in another, that's not how it operates in the offline world. So it's not going to go down well that way. I think, and then I guess the last thing is these social media bills. What a joke. They're a joke. They're a joke. You're going to go after X number of social media companies with this much revenue, and then the not-for-profits are oozing data of our kids every turn we make. All the online gaming, all the that's where all the communication with headsets and everything is happening. But somehow all the gaming is left out of these laws, and it's only the social media. We have to get back to age matters. And we need to, and we need to encourage people to be more truthful about their age. Maybe we need a warning label that says at the gate, lying about your age, claiming to be an age older. By the way, kids, your data now can go here, there, and the other. Like they don't want their data to be, and they don't want to be mined and profiled and sold. So let's get into the psyche of finding ways to get people to be more truthful about their age to protect them. And then the last thing I would say is, if companies have things that are appealing to kids, you need to find a way to deliver them in a with some safety in mind. So it shouldn't be an all or nothing at the front door, right? That's not what the mall looks like. It's not an all or nothing. There's bars within the mall. You don't pick an age and stop you at the front door necessarily. It's not natural. So
one thing I take away from these comments, and that I would love to highlight in closing, is that as you mentioned, Denise, you're going to rely quite a lot on strong encryption to provide this capability of verifying an age and enabling a system where somebody can send a flag saying, I am green light, I can access this service, red light, I can't, and nothing else. So the ability to rely on encryption is really important to achieve some of these other goals that are being pursued in a way that actually hurts encryption. And so that's one of the things I hope people are able to take away from this discussion. And with that, I want to say thank you again, Denise and Heather. I've learned quite a few things. I hope listeners will take a lot away from this. I know I did, and that we will. And so to be continued, though, and look forward to the next time that we have an opportunity to do this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.